The $400-ish mid-range segment has kind of sucked this generation at launch pricing, but the good news is both AMD and Nvidia have lowered prices on the 4060 Ti 8GB, 16GB, and the 7700 XT, which is what we're looking at in this video to get an idea of how do these actually stack up in the current market in the latest games. This is all fresh testing and new stuff. And so let's pause for a second and talk about what we're looking at here. So I've got this is the 4060 Ti 16GB. This is the Gigabyte Gaming OC version. The 8GB version I have is the NVIDIA Founders Edition, which I received as review samples. I also have the AMD 7700 XT. This is the Power Color Hellhounded version, which I again also received as a review sample. And these GPUs are interesting for a variety of reasons. One is that their pricing has all come down recently. Another is their VRAM capacities. Their 4060 Ti 8GB and 16GB are essentially exactly the same powerful, power level of graphics card, if that makes sense, in compute power. However, games these days can spill over 8GB of VRAM, in which case the 16GB of VRAM helps, but you end up paying a lot more for that VRAM, whereas AMD is offering the 7700 XT with 12GB of VRAM, which is oftentimes enough for 1080p and 1440p, even at the highest graphics settings. But when it launched, its price was absolutely ridiculous at $450, given that there were a lot stronger GPUs available for $500, so none of these cards actually reviewed particularly well. The 16GB 4060 Ti was $500 at launch, which was just way too expensive. The 7700 XT was too expensive at launch, and the 4060 Ti 8GB was not only too expensive at launch, but also only has the 8GB of VRAM. But things have actually changed quite a bit in the new market. If I was looking for a 4060 Ti right now, I can get an 8GB version for $365, rather than the $400 launch price. Still only has the 8GB of VRAM though. But the 16GB version is no longer $500. I could buy one today for $440, so it has come down significantly, although you'll notice that's still asking for 21% more money to get that 16GB VRAM card. So it is a lot more when it's not actually any more powerful unless the VRAM's coming into play, whereas the 7700 XT has dropped from a $450 launch price to I could buy one today for $375. And this one comes with 12GB of VRAM, which while it's not 16, it comes in very handy to have more than 8, as we'll see in today's testing. So this is a very interesting product. Also, currently, AMD has spiced up their 7800 XT and 7700 XT offerings with a game bundle, which is good, I think, through most of July in most regions. So actually good through August 17th. So, good until July 20th, and then you can redeem the code through August 17th. And you actually get to choose 2 of any of these 4 games. I can vouch for Lies of P being pretty awesome if you like Souls-like games. But anyway, there's a Company of Heroes 3, Starfield, Avatar. Looks like in Japan you can only choose 1 of the 4. Other regions looks like you get 2 out of the 4. So that's pretty cool. So if you're interested in any of that, that also kind of, like I said, makes that a little bit more interesting. But anyway, the other thing I have to say, though, is there's a lot of really interesting deals in the used market. And Jawa.gg is one of the, honestly, guys, if you haven't checked this place out, it is the marketplace for gamers. You can get the absolute best prices on custom pre-built PCs and gear, backed by buyer and seller protections that actually matter. So definitely search their listings, and I can help you out with $10 off your first purchase if you use code OWEN10 when checking out. Now, not only can you find awesome deals on all sorts of parts, entire pre-built systems, but you can also sell your own listings or even get instant cash hassle-free options where Jawa will just buy your GPU directly from you to help you fund your upgrade, which is pretty awesome to have that convenience. Again, they have a ton of pre-built systems at a wide variety of price ranges, built by expert PC builders, so you're getting something. If you're a little worried about building your whole thing, I get it. So that's awesome. And also, if you want some advice, check out their Discord community with over 10,000 members, which can get you, again, some of that expert feedback to make sure you're getting the best deal. So absolutely check out Jawa.gg. Huge thank you to them for sponsoring today's video. But again, if you're looking at these 3 cards, how do they actually stack up in the latest games? So let's keep running the footage here. This is Ghost of Tsushima at 1080p very high settings, and you can see the relative performance over here. So you can notice that the 4060 Ti 8GB and 16GB version are performing virtually identically. If they're within a few single-digit percentage points, realize they're different cooler models on the cards, and there's also slight run-to-run variance. So if they're so this is basically showing that the 16GB is irrelevant in this test because the card didn't need more than 8GB, in which case the extra VRAM does nothing for you. So you're paying a lot more for actually no benefit in this particular situation. Whereas the 7700 XT is just 23% faster in this test, which is awesome, and that isn't because it has more than 8GB of VRAM, it just is faster in this game. So I'm gonna go ahead and shrink myself tiny out of the way, and I'll pop out if there's anything particularly needed to talk about. But let's go ahead and run some more settings. So what if you're playing at 1440p resolution? Well, at 1440p very high settings, notice that I'm still not going over 8GB of VRAM in this test. I've seen some people say that sometimes cutscenes in this game, or if you play for longer periods of time, it might go over 8GB at these settings, so do keep that in mind. But the 7700 XT is just 31% faster here, averaging 76 FPS versus 58 FPS on the other two. So the 4060 Ti's are doing okay, but the 7700 XT was doing a lot better. Now, you might want to use upscaling and or frame generation, and interestingly, using frame generation here seems to be pushing us slightly over 8GB of VRAM, causing the 4060 Ti 16GB. This is actually important enough for us to probably pause for a second and talk a bit more about it. Notice the 16GB 4060 Ti is significantly faster than the 8GB version here in the averages and the 1% lows. I mean, it's not a massive difference, but it is showing you that using frame generation does increase VRAM usage. And so being at 8GB of VRAM can make frame generation much less usable. Now, also here, we're looking at some differences between DLSS and FSR, because I think that's going to be one of the biggest things to think about when deciding if you want to go with that AMD 7700 XT. In general, in motion, you'll see a little bit more breakup in the FSR image, which is something to think about. And then also, here we have different frame generation technologies. Interestingly, it seems like AMD's frame generation is offering a larger overall performance boost, but I am noticing a less smooth frame time graph, which is showing up in the 1% lows. So it seems like here, we're getting more overall interpolated frames from FSR3, but we're getting, less maybe a less stable, smooth frame rate on that. And that can vary game to game, I've noticed, and scene by scene. But just keep in mind that these aren't, apples to apples comparisons when we're doing FSR versus DLSS and frame generation. Generally, it's considered that the NVIDIA options do tend to offer better overall quality. Again, if you look at things like the edges of the, bow in motion and things like that, you can see more breakup in motion when you kind of pause it, slow it down. Some people will be more bothered by that than others. Anyway, but we're definitely seeing that at 1440p, even using upscaling and frame generation, the 8GB of VRAM can cause some issues here. If we go to DLSS FSR quality, but without using frame generation, notice that now the 8GB VRAM seems to be less of a thing, affecting performance. There's only slight differences between the two cards. The 7700 XT, again, is 26% faster than the 8GB 4060 Ti. But again, you're not getting quite the same level of image quality when you're using FSR versus DLSS, so something to think about. Now, if you just turn down to high settings instead of very high settings and don't use any upscaling at all the GPUs do pretty well here. But the 7700 XT is actually 35% faster than the 8GB 4060 Ti at 93 versus 69 FPS. And the 16GB card is at 71 FPS here. So again, most likely just run-to-run variance, like clock speed differences on the different cooler models, things like that. Let's go to Horizon Forbidden West, and at 1080p very high settings. Again, look at the 1% lows here, and look at the stutters you get in the 8GB card on its frame time graph compared to the 16GB card. This is a game where even at 1080p resolution, at settings you could otherwise do very well in, the 8GB card is stuttering, and the 16GB and 12GB cards are not having that problem. If you reduce down to high settings, though, that does get that under control. So now the 16 gigabyte and 8 gigabyte cards are performing about the same, and the 7700 XT is about 14% faster, so giving a better overall experience. But again, this Horizon Forbidden West example is definitely showing that even at 1080p resolution in the latest games designed around the newer console generation, a lot of times they're targeting more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM at the highest settings. At 1440p very high settings, we definitely see VRAM issues, where the 16 gigabyte card is much smoother than the 8 gigabyte card, with the 1% lows not good at all on our 8 gigabyte card. And then the average frame rate's affected as well, with the 7700 XT overall the fastest at 72 FPS versus 54 and 61 respectively. Now, you can kick on DLSS and FSR at the quality setting, and even then the 8 gigabyte card is still running into issues, and you can see that the other cards are significantly outperforming it, especially in the 1% lows where it can be very, very stuttery. So again, DLSS doesn't solve the option. I do think DLSS looks better in motion here than FSR does, so something to think about. But again, the 7700 XT was able to hit good settings without using upscaling. For example, if we go to 1440p high settings here, it's getting 73 FPS. You don't really need to be using upscaling necessarily. And even on the 4060 Ti 8 and 16 gigabyte cards, going down to the high settings seems to get a lot of the VRAM usage under control. And the 8 gigabyte card is having a pretty good experience here. And again, not really even needing any DLSS or anything like that. Although if you do kick on DLSS and FSR at the quality setting here, the cards come out much more similarly in performance. It seems like the 4060 Ti cards gain more performance with that upscaling than the 7700 XT did, which is kind of interesting. Although the 7700 XT still has an overall performance lead, although again, I would give the image quality advantage here edge to DLSS. Now, if we go to the most advanced Unreal Engine 5 game we've seen so far, we can look at Hellblade 2, Senua's Saga. At 1080p high settings, now notice in this game, high setting is the highest settings. There's no ultra or anything like that. We can see that only the 7700 XT is able to average over 60 FPS at 65, whereas the 4060 Ti's are averaging 55. If we go down to medium settings, all the cards are well over 60 FPS here, but the 7700 XT does have a 22% advantage over the 4060 Ti 8 gigabyte. So pretty big advantage here for the 7700 XT in this Unreal Engine 5 test, which is a very popular engine that a lot of games are going to be using. So that is definitely something to think about. Now at 1440p high settings, we see the 7700 XT take a 27% advantage over the 4060 Ti 8 gigabyte, and the 8 gigabyte card is underperforming the 16 gigabyte card by a little bit, not a lot, indicating we may be right on that 8 gigabyte VRAM borderline. And you can see that with the memory allocation on the 16 gigabyte card showing up as over 8 gigabytes of allocation. So could be running into some VRAM issues there again. At 1440p high with DLSS and FSR at the quality setting, we see that the VRAM issues seem to be under control as both 4060 Ti's perform identically at 57 FPS average, but the 7700 XT is hitting 69, nice, which gives it a 21% advantage over the 4060 Ti cards. Although again, DLSS versus FSR on the upscaling quality and all of that. At 1440p medium settings with no upscaling, the 7700 XT is able to go average over 60 FPS here at 64, whereas the 4060 Ti's are not, at averaging 52 and 53 respectively. Again, that looks like just difference in run-to-run variance and cooler model variance, not a VRAM issue here. 23% advantage for the 7700 XT in that test. If we do go ahead and kick on DLSS and FSR at the quality setting off of the medium preset baseline, we're now again seeing a large performance advantage for the 7700 XT, this time by 26% in the averages and 34% in the 1% lows. Although again, image quality differences, I would say again, do generally give advantage to DLSS here, so always something to keep in mind when it's not exactly apples to apples. But what about ray tracing? Well, in ray tracing workloads that aren't extreme, like Avatar 1080p Ultra, this includes ray tracing. This is a very like console-focused level of ray tracing. Actually, all of the GPUs here perform about the same. It's also interesting to note that the cards with more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM report more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM being used, which indicates there's a good chance that the game is streaming in lower quality textures on the 8 gigabyte card, although at these distances I wasn't able to pick out, obvious examples of it. So the game seems to be handling it well. At 1080p high settings, again, all of the GPUs are, single digit percentage points different from each other. I wouldn't call this a meaningful win for any of the cards here. And again, this is a ray tracing test. At 1440p Ultra, which again is a ray tracing test here, actually the 7700 XT is coming out in the lead, although not by a wide margin. And again, single digit performance differences between the two different 4060 Ti models. Again, this game seems to be most likely streaming in lower quality assets to deal with the lower VRAM amount without affecting performance. At 1440p Ultra, DLSS and FSR at the quality setting, we're now able to average roughly 60 FPS on all three cards. So performance balances out here, although if you look at things like the fence line and stuff like that, you'll notice that the DLSS image is much more stable. You see less aliasing and shimmering on things like that, those little details like in the fences in the background and stuff. At 1440p high settings, again, this is a ray tracing test, all the GPUs are averaging slightly over 50 FPS. So again, basically equal performance in ray tracing in this kind of lighter ray tracing workload. So again, the 7700 XT seems to come from a higher baseline of performance, so even if it loses more of its performance when engaging ray tracing, if it's a light enough ray tracing workload, that just brings it down about equal to the other cards. If we kick on DLSS and FSR at the quality setting at 1440p high as the baseline, all the GPUs are doing well, although now we're seeing the 4060 Ti's take a small but maybe noticeable lead over the 7700 XT at 5% and 8%, respectively. Honestly, if you're in a side-by-side test here, it'd probably be a little hard to really notice much of a difference other than maybe the DLSS image quality advantage. Now, in heavier ray tracing workloads like Alan Wake 2 with the RT high settings, even with DLSS and FSR at the quality settings, the 4060 Ti's take a massive performance lead, but I think we should stop and talk about this for a second because are you actually going to be using these settings? So in heavier ray tracing workloads, yes, the NVIDIA cards have a large advantage over the 7700 XT, but you're only averaging around 40 FPS, so that may not be how you want to play the game. You're also upscaling even off 1080p baseline resolution. So if that is how you would like to play the game, then hey, look, at heavy ray tracing workloads, we do have a big advantage. But I think a lot of PC gamers would chase a higher frame rate by turning the settings down a bit, rather than crazy levels of ray tracing. If we just reduce down to high settings and turn off the ray tracing, the game does still look fantastic. The 4060 Ti's are now close to 60 FPS, although we are showing an advantage for the card with more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and a large advantage for the 7700 XT, winning by 29% over the 4060 Ti 8 gigabyte. Again, it's looking like the 8 gigabytes is not quite enough for this game, even with ray tracing turned off. If we move up to 1440p resolution and we try to use the ray tracing at the high settings, even going DLSS and FSR to the balanced setting, which is fairly aggressive as far as I'd want to go personally at 1440p. Guys, we're not breaking 30 FPS on the 8 gigabyte card, and we're barely breaking it and below it in the 1% lows on the 16 gigabyte card. So again, how much are you really going to be using that heavy ray tracing at 1440p, right? At 1440p high settings with ray tracing turned off, none of the cards are breaking 60 FPS. However, the 8 gigabyte card is definitely struggling more than the other two, giving the 7700 XT a 32% advantage over it, and the 16 gigabyte card an 11% advantage over the 8 gigabyte card. Now, if you kick on DLSS and FSR at the quality settings, the 8 gigabyte card is still falling the furthest behind, indicating that once again, 8 gigabytes is not enough, even with ray tracing turned off and even with DLSS running at the quality setting. Again, here that we see the 7700 XT now taking a 46% advantage over the 8GB card, and the 16GB card taking a 19% lead. Now, if we want to look at another heavy ray tracing workload, we could look at Cyberpunk with 1080p RT overdrive mode. And even at 1080p using DLSS and FSR at the quality settings, we're not getting a great experience on really any of the GPUs, although I would argue the 4060 Ti 16GB is the most usable here. And these at these heavy ray tracing workloads, they are taking a more noticeable lead over the AMD card. If you go to more reduced ray tracing settings, like just using the Ultra preset with RT reflections and not upscaling at 1080p, which would be my preference, then notice we do go over 8GB of VRAM usage, causing problems for the 8GB card, whereas the 7700 XT is behind the 16GB 4060 Ti, but not wildly so, at 65 versus 71 FPS in the averages. If you just play at 1080p Ultra with no ray tracing, then all of these cards are offering you a high refresh rate experience, although the 7700 XT is the highest at 118 FPS versus 95 and 97 respectively, giving it a 24% advantage over the 8GB 4060 Ti, so pretty noticeable lead there, although every card is delivering a good experience here. Now, some areas of Phantom Liberty can be more demanding than this built-in benchmark. If we try to use the highest levels of ray tracing at 1440p, if you go all the way down to performance mode upscaling, which is only a 720p internal resolution, it's not great. You can kind of start to get to playable frame rates on the 4060 cards, especially on the 16GB version, which is outperforming the 8GB version, indicating that 8GB is a bit of an issue there. But I really don't want to use performance mode upscaling personally on a 1440p display. It's pretty low. If we go to just RT reflections added onto the Ultra preset and use DLSS and FSR at the quality setting, I think we're getting a much better experience. And notice that the 7700 XT can match the 8GB card, but the 16GB card beats them both due to the higher ray tracing performance and not having issues due to the 8GB of VRAM. At 1440p Ultra, without any ray tracing turned on, the 7700 XT actually has a dominating 40% advantage over the 4060 Ti 8GB, which is pretty interesting, giving it 77 FPS versus 55. The 16GB card scoring a little better at 57, but again, pretty dominating win there when ray tracing is turned off. If you go down to the high settings, the 7700 XT leads by 28%. At 88 versus 69 and 70, respectively, and is also leading in the 1% lows by 24% at 73 versus 59 and 60. So they all give a good experience at 1440p high, but definitely a much higher refresh rate experience on that 7700 XT. So with Cyberpunk, you just want to think about, how much you're trying to push those RT features, and are the 4060 Ti's really offering a great experience with that? Something to think about. Resident Evil 4 1080p max settings does include ray tracing, and it does go over 8GB of VRAM. Look at the massive stuttering issues in the 1% lows that you get on the 8GB card. And so overall, the 7700 XT is performing the best here, although it's almost tied with the 16GB 4060 Ti, and the 1% lows are a disaster on the 8GB card. If you go down to the 1080p prioritized graphics settings, though, which turns off ray tracing and reduces VRAM usage quite a bit, now the 4060 Ti's are performing about the same, and they're performing very well, although the 7700 XT takes a 16% advantage. It's taking a lead here, but every card is performing extremely well at these settings. At 1440p max settings, which does include ray tracing in this game, we see that the 4060 Ti 8GB is basically broken, offering these massive frame time spikes, giving you a pretty bad experience overall. Whereas the 16GB card does a good job, and so does the 7700 XT. With the 7700 XT actually offering the highest performance here, even though this is a ray tracing test, although it's a light ray tracing workload. At 1440p prioritized graphics, we see that every card performs well, but the 7700 XT takes a 29% lead over the 8GB 4060 Ti. And the 16GB card is only 2 FPS faster than the 8GB card. So again, all cards doing well here, but definitely a much better experience on the 7700 XT. Now, what about Starfield? Well, at Starfield at 1080p Ultra, all the cards are performing about the same. The 1% lows can be a little bit inconsistent, so I wouldn't read too much into this. There seems to be a bit of loading traversal stutter in this game, especially in these city areas, and there can be overall just kind of platform limitations and engine limitations on that a little bit. So I wouldn't read too much into the 1% lows. Overall, the performance is about the same on all of them here. At 1440p Ultra, again, all of the cards are performing about the same, although this time we're under 60 FPS on all of these cards. They're all actually slightly below 50. Again, the 1% lows show the largest difference, with the 7700 XT coming in on top. But again, the 1% lows can be a little bit inconsistent in the city areas in this game. If you kick on DLSS and or FSR at the quality setting, performance does jump up to around 60 FPS on all of these cards. And again, they're all providing about the same performance level. However, note that I would again give an image quality advantage to DLSS, especially in motion, and there's a little bit more instability issues and things like that with the FSR image. So I would overall say that Starfield's giving a better experience there on the NVIDIA GPUs. However, if we kick on frame generation, we're once again looking at FSR frame generation versus DLSS frame generation. And this time, unlike in Ghost of Tsushima where I tested it, I'm getting a nice smooth frame time graph and 1% lows from FSR3 on the 7700 XT. So it seems to be working a bit better in this game and giving the 7700 XT overall the highest frame rate, although not necessarily, identical image quality. It's a different technology. It's not apples to apples. In Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 at 1080p basic settings, something like you might use turn down settings, get a high frame rate, all the cards deliver a good experience here, over 200 FPS, but the 7700 XT is taking a 21% advantage over the 4060 Ti 8GB. So all of them doing well, but definitely a win for the 7700 XT. At 1440p basic settings, the 7700 XT takes a 26% lead over the 4060 Ti 16GB, and the 8GB and 16GB cards are performing about the same. Again, there can be some slight variances in the 1% lows, which mostly shows up right at the end of the test, where there's kind of this explosion right at the end, and you can see a little bit of a frame time spike on the frame time graph, which kind of throws things off a little bit there. All right. So we've ran a massive amount of tests at tons of graphic settings because I want to show you guys how people might actually use the graphics cards rather than just crank everything to ultra. I think that's especially important when you're looking at cards that might suffer on VRAM usage like the 8GB 4060 Ti, because is the 8GB an issue at 1080p and 1440p? And the answer is yes, occasionally, but you can always turn down the settings to get it under control. However, it kind of limits how well things like frame generation work because that uses extra VRAM. In general, I stand by kind of where I've always been on this card, which is this card is kind of hamstrung by its 8GB of VRAM. I would not personally be spending that much money on an 8GB graphics card unless I was actually playing games like, Call of Duty at reduced settings. In other words, if you're playing esports games where you're probably turning down graphic settings to chase high frame rates, and that's pretty much your PC usage. In that case, I don't think 8GB of VRAM is going to be that big of a deal because you're going to be turning down graphic settings anyway. So that's something to think about. That's a use case where I think the 8GB card might not be an issue for people. Other than that, if you're playing a lot of the latest and latest, I won't necessarily say greatest, but latest single player games, and you want to turn up the graphics settings to something like what a PS5 can do, well, a PS5 has more than 8GB of VRAM, and so games designed for it want to use more than 8GB of VRAM. However, 12 never seemed to be an issue in any of the tests from a VRAM perspective, and neither did 16. So I would definitely rather have a 7700 XT or a 16GB 4060 Ti than the 8GB card. But then the problem is, look at the pricing, right? So as we talked about in the video, at current pricing, the 16GB 4060 Ti, the lowest price I can find is $440, and the 7700 XT I can find for $375 plus 2 free games. That's a 17% price increase if you want to think about it that way, if you want to get the 4060 Ti 16GB instead of the instead of the 7700 XT. Now, you do get an extra 4 gigabytes of VRAM, which could be interesting, especially if you're buying an NVIDIA GPU for productivity reasons, AI models, 3D modeling, things like that oftentimes are not only better supported on NVIDIA, but might often run better on 16 gigabytes of VRAM than 12. So that's a use case to think about where that might make sense. But for gaming, if gaming is your use case here, again, if we scroll back through this and we look at these performance numbers, notice that the 7700 XT is almost always noticeably faster than even the 16 gigabyte 4060 Ti, and it's doing it for less money. And the cases where it's not faster is generally when you're using ray tracing, and when you're using lighter ray tracing workloads like an Avatar, it's basically a tie. And when you're using heavier ray tracing workloads, something like this, then honestly, you're not getting that great of an experience on the 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte either, which means that at the levels of ray tracing these cards can perform at, the 7700 XT is not at a huge disadvantage. So if you are interested in running 30 FPS, heavy ray tracing workloads with a lot of upscaling, then maybe that 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte, maybe that matters for you a bit. But I've got to say, so overall, for my personal preference, if I was buying at this price point for gaming, I'd go with the 7700 XT, unless perhaps I was esports specifically focused, in which case I'd be less concerned about the 8 gigabyte card. If I was going for more of a mixed use case with productivity and things like that thrown in, that's where I think maybe that 16 gigabyte 4060 Ti starts making some amount of sense, as it is the cheapest NVIDIA GPU with 16 gigabytes of VRAM. So it does have that kind of unique feature going for it. Now, the other thing I'd say, though, is if you actually start looking into the 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte, we run into a bit of a challenge because, okay, if the 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte costs $440, you're starting to get pretty close in price to a 7800 XT, which we didn't look at in this video. That starts at $470. So not a massive price difference there. If we actually want to kind of pop in here, we could do 470 divided by 440. And we're seeing it's only 7% more money to buy a 7800 XT instead of a 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte, in which case you're getting 16 gigabytes of VRAM. It's AMD instead of NVIDIA, so if you're talking about certain productivity workloads and things like that, sometimes those are better accelerated by NVIDIA, so keep that in mind. You do have the better upscaler and things like that, but a 7800 XT, I mean, even the 7700 XT was already usually beating these 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte by a noticeable margin. And the 7800 XT is significantly faster than that. So actually, that's a test that I'm actually in the process of testing out a 7800 XT in the same set of games. And I'm going to do a dedicated head-to-head video of the 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte up against the 7800 XT in the same set of games. So if you guys are interested in that, stay tuned to the channel. And again, if you're thinking about upgrading your computer, take a look at Jawa.gg. They have the marketplace for gamers, and again, I can get you $10 off your first purchase using code OWEN10. Take a look at their pre-built systems. Think about selling your GPU. You can get an instant cash offer from Jawa if you want to take all the hassle out of that. All of that's great stuff. Huge thank you to them for sponsoring today's video, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.